Thank you and good morning. So, like it or not, Donald Trump will be the 47th president of the United States, and he will enter the White House with control of the Senate, likely control of the House, a Supreme Court that's favorable to his views, and the popular vote. So the question is, what will he do as president, and what can he do? And I want to try and cover some of that today. So we talked last week that the election was a battle between competing visions for the future, and really with a very big focus on these areas of trade, taxes, geopolitics, the dollar. Do we ever get our fiscal house in order? Regulatory issues and immigration issues were what was being contested. And we have a very divided country even still. While Trump won the popular vote, interestingly, about 250,000 votes in 3 states determine the Electoral College. With Wisconsin, he won by 30,000, Michigan by 75,000, and Pennsylvania by 145,000. Had those 3 states gone the other way, Harris would have been declared the winner, and we would have been having a very different discussion today. So the question is, where do we go from here? And does he have the mandate, and what can he do? I think with Congress, even, he's still in a spot where he has to try and figure how supported he will be with the Republican Congress, and where is he going to run into problems. And I think this chart was really instructive, where you can see what Trump can do with executive action versus where he requires Congress and where he's going to get challenged. And I think what he's going to focus on is what he's talked about, tariffs, first and foremost. I think the deportation of undocumented immigrants will be, the immigration issue will be the second thing he's going to be very focused on right off the bat, deregulation, and then trying to get a tax package. And I skipped Powell and the Fed because I think that'll be a secondary issue to the other ones. Not that there won't be discussions about it, there already has been, but I don't think that's going to be the primary target, particularly as Powell has been in a rate lowering mode right now. If he was to delay that much when Trump was president, I think you'd see a lot more vocal discussion coming out of the president there. But I think this really gives you a sense of where the focus is going to be. It's what he's talked about on the campaign trail, and it's what he's going to focus on. So let's jump into this a little bit more. So starting with tariffs, which he can do by executive order on individual countries for individual problems, but I don't believe he can do the across-the-board one without getting caught up in Congress and the courts. Goldman was out last week suggesting that their view, the likely outcome would be 20% tariffs on China and 5% on the rest of the world. I think you can see from this chart, we are going back in terms of tariffs. Do they work, and will it work is a question. A lot of people go back to the washer dryer tariffs that were put in back in 2018. You saw prices rise while the tariffs were imposed, but you also saw 2 companies revert their production to the US, with Samsung and LG both moving factories here. So in a sense, it did have a change. And when the tariffs expired, the prices did drop. But the prices are still elevated from where before when the tariffs were hit. I think the other issue is, how is he going to use tariffs? Is it a policy or a negotiating ploy? Scott Bessert, who is considered one of the candidates for Secretary of Treasury, used to work for Soros as a hedge fund manager, came out and said the other day that the policy on tariffs is escalate to de-escalate. And the idea is that they're going to approach countries on a one-off basis to create better, more favorable terms of trade. And that will be, they're using the tariffs as the hammer for that. Here are the people with trade surpluses that would be the most likely targets right off the bat. And you can see how this might play out. I suspect that a lot of this will be negotiation. Former President Trump, soon to be President-elect Trump, would prefer to see one-off deals rather than multilateral arrangements. He thinks he gets a better deal when he goes one-on-one. I think there's I think it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. I will say that China has had plenty of time to position themselves for the potential tariffs. And one of the things I think I got wrong about the way China was managing their stimulus was that in large part they were waiting to see what the impact of the presidential election would be on their finances and would they need to do more to support their currency. And there is questions right now that if China lowers their currency by 6 to 8%, that may offset any tariff increases that are coming from the U.S. So they're preparing for this just like they've been preparing for sanctions for a while. So switching gears to Trump, Powell, and the Fed, I think the market is in for a bit of a surprise in terms of the ability of Trump to force rates down. I don't believe that this is the first fight he's going to take on, as I mentioned earlier. I think there's another reason to not make Powell the centerpiece. If rates don't come down fast enough and there are economic difficulties in the next 2 years, when Powell's term is up, then he could blame Powell for it, put in a new head of the Fed, potentially. The Fed has taken some steps to make sure that their independence is protected. There could be a whole discussion on this mark at a later date, but basically the way the voting works for the Fed chair, you can nominate a Fed chair position, but the Fed Board of Governors is the one who votes on it. And that is people that can preserve the independence of the Fed. So there'll be more to come on this. I don't think it's the priority for the administration right now because, one, they are lowering rates. The economy is strong. I would argue that maybe we shouldn't be lowering rates as much as we are, but for right now, it's favorable to what Trump would like. So I don't think that's where the issue is going to be. I think the bigger issue that is one that really helped get him elected was mass deportations and the immigration problem. I think that securing the border is a top priority, and it's one that was a winning part of his campaign. I think the idea of the mass deportation is going to be challenged from logistics as well as from just the practical nature of doing it and how much stuff can you get done in a short period of time. But to get to that number would be historic, and I think it would be quite difficult to do. That said, I also think there's another element he's going to run into. Aside from the logistics, I think the focus will be closing the border and headline deportation of criminals. I think the immigration policy, getting it right, is going to be critical for the U.S. and for nations around the world. We have demographic cliffs, labor shortages, and skills availability that are already problematic in many areas of the economy. I know for myself, my mother's 95, needs caregivers, and many of the caregivers that are coming today are coming from places like the Philippines, where you get nurses, get really high quality care. There's a big fear in that community that mass deportations will have a big impact on the elderly who need this kind of support. You go to the farmers in California and other areas, and they need the immigrants to come in. So getting this right is going to be a major issue. After you get through the headlines of the illegal immigrants, there is a whole need to get legal immigrants coming in the right way to drive the economy forward. And I think this is one of the areas that you will see a lot of action from Trump and his administration right away, because he doesn't need support from Congress to do this. I think the other area that has been a big issue for the economy is the regulatory burden that picked up under President Biden. And when these numbers were put forth and sent to, this is courtesy of our friends Andy LaPerriere at Piper Sandler, when Andy got these numbers from the American Action Forum and other areas, he actually questioned, could they be right? He thought there was a data error in it because it was so unusually high under the Biden administration. And it turns out that this is, in fact, the cost that we're seeing. This is an area that Trump can very aggressively act without Congress to lower regulations, and you will see that coming quite quickly. And to put it in perspective, the first screen was in dollars. This is in percent of GDP. And you're at 1.3% of GDP, slightly below where we were in 2012 when the Dodd-Frank bill came through. And you can see really a lot of the earlier regulations in the end of the Bush and early Obama administration were around the great financial crisis. So this regulatory increase has really hit companies, and the burden on small companies versus the large ones has created some of the division that's going on. And why this is important is when you combine lower regulation with lower energy costs, because that is the other part of Trump's regulatory regime, is going to go after freeing up the energy production in the U.S. to be even a greater force in the global system, not just for fossil fuels, but also for renewables. It'll be an America First part of the agenda, which will bring costs down, both regulatory and energy costs down for companies, that could help offset some of the other problems that are coming and could put the small cap area into a much better position moving forward. And if he combines that with even lowering taxes or just the extension of the tax credits, tax program that's in place right now, that'll give companies a better runway to invest. So will the tax agenda get put through? I think he's going to go for and put a proposal to Congress of a 15% tax cut on corporations and some of the other things he talked about on the campaign trail. I think he's going to hit two powerful forces. One is a Congress that is generally going to be supportive of a lot of the things, but the debt and deficit issues are facing everyone every day. And I think they're going to be quite worried about that. And at the same time, you have the bond vigilantes who've pushed rates up considerably over the since the Fed cut, that are starting to weigh on the system. And I think this is going to limit the ability of Congress to be as aggressive in doing what Trump would like. I think they can fund likely the extension of the tax cuts and use some of the lower energy costs, lower regulatory costs to offset some of the increased cost in other areas and push things forward. But I don't believe the major tax cut will get through, even with having the House potentially and the Senate backing him, because I do think that the worries of where we're going in debts are big, and they are starting to crowd out other areas of spend. And as much as we'd like to think we can take a lot of money out of the system, I think it'll take time, even if they were able to reduce the cost inside the Washington. I think it'll take a long enough time for that to happen. So how do we move forward? You can't move forward without productivity improvements. And one of the changes that has to occur, and you can see from this chart, productivity was on the upswing as we were lowering taxes. But when the pandemic hit, we started to increase government costs. The non-farm payroll started to take a turn when we started giving the giveaways out. And you could see how non-farm payroll for the U.S. productivity declined, and now it's starting to come up again, but then it's starting to flatline. I think we have to unleash productivity in the U.S. I think part of that is the government getting out of the way and stopping the giveaways and letting the system get back to working on track again. But if we don't get productivity up with our debt and deficits, we will have a big problem. I think we're working through that problem right now. So with the new administration, there's a lot of worry about volatility. And I think the way people need to start to think about investing in the public markets as well as the private markets is thinking about in sound investment principles versus the politics of the short-term politics that we're looking at. Because through all these, back through the 60s, this chart is up and to the right with volatility inside it, but staying long equities will work in this environment. Trying to whipsaw and time the market is going to be a problem. I think we've overcome a lot of bad politics in the history of the U.S. and even in this last 70-year time period or 60-year time period. So I say stay long here, and just owning the right areas is going to be important. I think that is going to continue to be U.S. energy, defense industry. One of the interesting things is we're already seeing foreign governments really change their behaviors around the Trump administration. So you saw Taiwan already put a proposal to the U.S. for a significant increase in defense spending, saying they're ready to step up and do their part to defend them. They want the U.S. to stay a part of that. You saw Europe and Brussels starting to discuss changes to the fiscal regime there that would allow them to move dollars that were already allocated but unspent for past crises to move over to the defense spending to get that up, which is also a kind of a sign of part of what Trump originally said was he wants the rest of the world to pay their fair share, and you are seeing governments react to that already. I think he does continue to increase the uncertainty, but he has a big agenda that he will not be able to fully implement, I don't believe, and that will create a better sense of certainty in what is pretty unclear right now. But I think he won't be able to get everything through. I think the low growth, high debt and levels will continue to persist. I think getting the debt managed, debt interest costs managed, and getting the growth up is going to be critical, but it is going to create bigger divergences. And the more government support that goes into the system, the better the big companies will do. And I think that creates a bigger divergence between the haves and have-nots. I think it's too early to tell what the inflation outlook is going to be, but I think generally the trends will continue down if we don't blow it up with the tariffs and other bad policy mistakes. I think rates will not go down as low as people will wish, but I don't think you'll see a big push up in rates either. I think we will have competing forces that will offset both of those, but I think the trend of it continuing to go as low as central banks would like will be meeting some pressures due to market conditions. That said, I think the U.S. continues to attract capital. I think the yield differentials are significant. I think our economic strength continues to surprise. As I said, I don't believe the Fed is needed to be as aggressive as they have been so far this year. I do think some of that is politics. I think there may be also surprise on the relative strength of the U.S. I think the yield differentials continue to attract capital here, as well as the safe haven status of the U.S. So I think we're going to continue to move forward. I think it will be bouncy. I don't think the worst fears of Trump will be realized, but I don't think the fullness of his agenda will be realized either. And I do hope that Washington and the system in the U.S. of governing prevails in that we get the right checks and balances in place to move the system forward in a healthy way. So, Mark, I'll stop there and open it up for comments.
Thanks, Stephen.
Oh, and just before we get to that, I put in the chat, we do have a call that we're hosting today. We're backed by a family office out of Canada, Miles Nadal. We'll be having Frank Luntz, who is one of the leading pollsters in the world, give his views of the election and what it means. I put the link in the chat, so feel free to sign up for that and welcome everyone to join. So, Mark, turn it over to you.
Yeah, that'll be a special event, so everybody, if you can make it, highly recommend. Adam Blanco.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Stephen. Great presentation. When you talk about productivity, need to increase productivity, how will mass deportation, if it happens, how will that impact productivity? That's first question. Second question is, how do you improve productivity?
AI is driving productivity forward in ways that we can't imagine, so it's going to require that spend to come. I actually think mass deportation may force productivity improvements on industries like the fast food industry and others that you're going to have to adapt technologies because of either labor scarcity or labor costs rising because of the limits that would push you to substitute technology for labor. I think that's really what's gonna come. I would be surprised, shocked, and wrong if we get to anywhere near even half of the 7.5 that he has talked about deporting. I think it's a logistical nightmare. And I don't think that's the win for him. I think the win is closing the border and starting to get the criminals out and making people feel safer.
Thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome. There was a question from Chaz on
DeFi.
DeFi and crypto and assets in general. I think Trump's desire for lower interest rates as a policy would help assets overall. I think inflation coming down and continuing to come down and deregulation helps assets considerably. And he's touted that he wants to be the crypto king. So I think there'll be a lot more favorable support for those areas. I think that's it. He's trying to move things forward. I think one of the questions that will come out of all that is, what does it mean for the dollar? And I think the dollar's lost some of its value in trade since the Trump administration. I still think it's very difficult to replace the dollar, but the autocratic nations are doing a good job coming up with currency swaps and alternatives that make the dollar less important. So we have to be vigilant about how we manage that part of the process.
There are a couple other questions in the chat, but Duncan, yes, you got your hand up.
Hey, Stephen, so I'm just curious, what is the trade surplus that Europe has, the EU has with us? What drives that? I mean, I don't think I buy anything made in Europe. Is it tourism? But it says goods. What?
No, it would be there is some technology coming from there. There is a lot of trade between the US and Europe. It is a major trading partner in a lot of different areas, autos being one of them, luxury goods being another one, including wines and other areas. But there is pretty consistent trade back and forth between the US and we don't get all our junk from one place.
Yeah, I'm just surprised that there's such a surplus. It just seems like I mean, I lived in the UK for a long time. I felt like there were plenty of Americans things to buy over there. I mean, it doesn't feel right observation-wise. I'm just trying to understand that whole thing.
Well, I would, and I have to go check the numbers, but I would think the UK is in there as well. So it's the broader Europe as well. But I understand what you're saying, but it's such a big economy, Duncan. We forget that it is all rolled up the largest economy in the world if you take all of Europe together.
Yeah.
So, but I think the issue is less attacks on Europe and more how they're positioning to force change. And he is forcing change, and European companies are actually moving over here because of energy costs in other areas too, and prepping to be closer to the market. So I think there's a lot of things that they're really focused on.
Marius, which researchers have that analysis of the GDP reduction as a result of the deportation?
Yeah, I can post the source and a link in a second.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why I don't think they'll ever get to that number, Mark. I think it will have an economic impact.
There's the article for it.
Thank you. And Javier had a question, or he was just trying to make a point. Stephen also saw it about AI. You were talking about productivity and AI, but they are obviously different factors.
Yeah, it's not always the same factor, but yes, it will drive. I think it drives. That was where I was talking about technology in general, not just AI, improving productivity and substituting capital for labor wherever. AI isn't the answer for everything, that's for sure. I do think the other thing that we didn't touch on is the makeup of his cabinets and how that goes through, that I think will be very important. He learned from his lessons the last time of having people that will be obstructionist. It's just a question of, it's a big agenda, and most times presidents don't get through all that much. And Trump is a one-term president now. You know, he doesn't get another term this time around. So it's a different setup than we're used to from other presidencies.
Mr. Hammer.
So, Stephen, you're saying that he won't get everything he wants. One of the things I'm looking at is his demand for the Senate, the folks who are going for the Senate leadership positions to agree to recess appointments. So he doesn't have to go through the advise and consent part of it. And to the extent that it looks like they're going to agree to it, I think that suggests that Congress is not going to be acting as much of a check or a balance.
I think you have to separate out. I think where they become a check and a balance is more on the budget issues and the deficit and what gets approved budget-wise rather than candidate-wise or cabinet appointment-wise. So I think there's a difference there, Michael, but I think what you're raising is something that is alarming.
I mean, to follow on that, Stephen, I know you'd mentioned, he mightn't get everything through, but this term you said is different, but he's only a one-term president, but he's learned how to govern because of his first term. And I think the speed in which he runs through his agenda will be so much quicker. A couple of reasons. One, he has the experience of learning how to govern. And then secondly, he has all branches of the government behind him. So nothing to oppose him, no checks and balances. And thirdly, the speed at which he has, the disdain he has for regulations, institutions, etc. He'll just run roughshod over them as he tries to implement, whether it be Project 2025 or other. So my fear is, and I know you might have touched on it at the beginning, is what are the institutions there to provide the checks and balances for whatever he's pushing through? Whether you're for him or against him is irrelevant. It's just the process and speed in which he'll try to push a lot of his agenda through, I think, might be unsettling for many.
I think his whole setup is going to be unsettling for many. So I agree with that. I think that if you go back to the areas that I said he could do things with executive order, that will be his focus aside from taxes. So tariffs, immigration and deregulation, that he can do by executive order, that will be his focus. Getting his tax cuts, the 17 tax cuts extended will be a big issue. And I think what's going to be, there was an article in the Journal yesterday about it by the Fed whisperer, Nick Timiraos, where he was saying that the issue that everyone's asking in DC is, what's the number? And the number is how much of a deficit can Republicans tolerate and still be reasonably fiscally prudent? And that will determine what of the tax agenda could be put through. And I think when you look at the tax cuts, extension of them, and I don't have the exact number off the top of my head what that means to the deficit, but I think it would be around a $4 trillion number versus a $1.9 trillion number now. And I don't think they could do lowering the tax cuts from 21 to 15, eliminating federal income tax in several areas like Social Security payments and other areas, that he can get all that done. So that's where I think you start to run into a problem of the math, making the math work. And I think it would be a win for him to extend the 17 tax cuts and throw a few other tax cuts in, but I don't see them going from 21 to 15 easily. And if I'm wrong on that, then the economy should do much better in the near term.
In the
Or
short
the market should do better in the near term.
But fiscal prudence, even for Republicans, has gone through the window. I know you said, it depends on how much the Republicans can, stomach what deficit there is. But immediate gratification is rampant in DC right now. It's all about getting the House getting reelected in 2 years and a third of the Senate in 4 years. I don't think they think about what the impact of the deficit or the debt in, I don't know, a generation's time. I just don't think that's in their calculus. Do you think, unlike a generation ago, I mean, do you think that's different or that has changed?
I think there's a group of people waiting. I agree with what you're saying, but I think there's a group of people waiting to run for office for the next presidency. And I think there are people inside both parties figuring out what they need to do to win that. And I don't think they want to be the guy walking in with massive deficits. The Republicans, if you're a Republican, I don't think you want to be going into the midterms or the next presidential election with a big deficit that you created.
Let's keep it going. I know Robin, Wanda, and Bill. Just Giovanni, I'm looking at you upside down. If you can turn your camera device up.
That's
All right.
helpful. I was just going to comment that it seems to me in the picks that he's already making for the cabinet that he is setting up some grooming of future leaders for the party in a very clear message. So those folks will bear some investigation and listening to. But you didn't talk very much about the healthcare sector. I saw a comment in the chat that Musk's proposing this $2 trillion cut, really kind of focused on reducing healthcare subsidies and Social Security. What is your take on that, and how important do you think that's going to be?
Obviously, figuring out our healthcare cost is massive. We're 16% of GDP in healthcare, probably double any other advanced nation. I'm not sure how fixable that is quickly. So I don't really have a good sense there. I think the bigger issue around healthcare is going to be the impact of AI and lowering the R&D cost, which could go a long way in right-sizing that 16%. But I don't know what having Kennedy involved or some of these other guys involved are going to actually do to fix the system that quickly. So I don't really have a good sense of that. But I do think AI and what it can do will help lower the cost overall, regardless of whether they think they can take a lot of costs out of there, because I'm not sure they can.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You're welcome.
Wanda?
Lee Zeldin of Long Island has been named or suggested as the EPA czar. And his track record, at least, is mixed. He's representing Long Island, and there are conflicting priorities. So, Stephen, I have two questions. First one is, can you speculate, being from Long Island, what we can expect from the new EPA under Zeldin, and specifically with the role of Elon Musk in this administration and the high cost of regulations regarding the emissions from, cars, where these regulations will go? Will Elon Musk, in essence, secure the standards that were proposed by the old EPA? So in the nutshell, Zeldin, EPA, climate change and emission, and the cost of the regulations.
I am from Long Island. I don't have an answer for you on what Zeldin will do or what he's done. Honestly, I don't spend as much time on local politics, so I'm not sure. On Trump's energy plan, it's instead of what the Biden administration policy would have been more an all-of-government approach to climate change. I think Trump is moving to an all-of-government approach to domestic energy production, both renewables and fossil fuels. I think it's more about continuing to lower our cost and creating a secure national security issues resolved by being sufficient in energy, and also using all the tools so that you can and can keep those costs down for an extended period. So I think that is going to be the approach. I think on deregulation, I think they're going to really focus on greenlighting the LNG exports, and I think they may roll back the green subsidies in the IRA and use that money to fund some of the other things that he'd like to do. But I think those are the areas he's going to focus on. But I think it'll be, everyone thinks it's just going to be oil and natural gas and fracking, but I think he wants a fuller agenda. And I think we need that to not have China be the only player. They're already the dominant player in renewables. I think the world needs to start developing alternatives to them. And if the US isn't part of that, I think that'll be a problem. So I think that's where they're going to focus. But I think he is going to be much more aggressive on environmental, rolling back environmental, labor, and other rules that were part of the Biden agenda.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bill? You're on mute, Bill.
I'm getting perilously close to a very large bar tab.
There you go.
Anyway, so yeah, comment and then a question. Even though Trump definitely has a significant mandate, from the election results, we still have to remember that in the Senate, there are 3 Republican senators that are not, fully on board: Collins, Murkowski, and Romney. So it's a slim margin. And the news, I guess, as of this weekend, is that the Republicans have just taken enough seats in the House to be able to secure that. There's still some races outstanding, but his margins are still tenuous. So I think that it's probably not going to be as much of a steamroller, although I think that the first 30 days are going to be pretty head spinning as far as what he's going to be proposing. But at the same time, given that it is a one-term presidency, and I think that kind of the new Republicans, so to speak, really want to try to set this thing up for the next election, they're going to have to be careful about how they propose things. And I think it's going to be so crucial for them to secure a lot of good, solid wins for the coalition that they were able to put together, because I think that's a fragile coalition as well, since so many segments are traditionally Democrat. So anyway, that's a comment. And then quick question on the dollar. Stephen, I think that's a great point to raise. And we're up, the DXY is like up to 106 now, which is relatively strong. I wonder if it's going to keep going a little bit further, based on optimism for the US. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't have a sense on the dollar, Bill, other than I think I think the strength of our economy is reflected in the strength of the dollar right now. I think that that's good for us since we're big consumers, but I don't know if it's going to hold that way. I think we have to see how yield differentials go, what the central bank policies are, and also how the tariffs actually start to kick in. So I think all those things will play in.
So
I
Giovanni,
think Giovanni's been dying to get in, so
he's if he
I'm
doesn't
ready.
if he doesn't speak now, he's gonna walk around his office again.
If you're okay, because I got my finger on the pulse of the Inflation Reduction Act, because as it relates to natural gas and flare gas and wasted energy and so on and so forth, our opinion is, and I'm putting my money where my mouth is, so I'm not just pontificating. Inflation Reduction Act will be partially rolled back as it relates to renewable power, but not as all those subsidies for oil and gas companies to solve the problem with wasted energy, natural gas and flare gas and so on and so forth. That's never going to go away. So that's solid, right? If you want to know which way the Trump administration is going, I would say the best leading indicator is who becomes the Senate, the president. If it's Rick Scott, it means that the Trump administration is going the way of, let's say, autocracy, because Rick Scott, which is third in the rankings of who might win the Senate presidency, has promised to Trump, or has advocated already publicly, that he will allow Trump to not get, let's say, Senate confirmation for secretaries or so and so forth. And if let's just sort of take the ex-border, customs and immigration guy who's now considered the border czar, which is a position that doesn't need Senate confirmation. So let's say they put a pawn in the role of the border secretary of customs and immigration or something, but the border czar sits above him, then essentially the Senate confirmation people will be taking directions from the border czar. So it's essentially a sign in autocracy. And if Rick Scott does not win that, then we're looking at potentially a more normal Republican Senate where, Olympia Snow and those 2-3 Republican senators that you mentioned might have a role. The question is, will they be able to be pebbles in the Republican shoe, or will they just be crushed in, America seeking more of a decisive government and presidency, as opposed to this sort of feckless thing that we call democracy and checks and balances? I think the American people have voted that they're tired of checks and balances, and they want their government to be more assertive and decisive, and that the way government works as envisioned by the Constitution is defined by the American people as being no achievements, feckless, and so on and so forth. So if you want to know about those 3 senators, look at Rick Scott. That's my point. There we go.
Thank you.
Michael Hammer.
So I've heard on this call and in other places, folks talking about, well, he's only got 1 term. What I haven't heard people talking about are the risks that he doesn't complete his term, given his age, and Vance stepping up and taking over. So that's one point. The other point with regard to oil and gas, what's really been driving production has not been drilling on federal lands. It's been drilling on private lands. And again, because I'm in the middle of the Utica and I have interests. What's interesting is that EOG and Encino are starting to drill going down to the Black River Trenton layers, which is not really shale, it's pooled oil. And there's indications this may be even bigger than the Permian. EOG just had their investor call. I didn't sit in, but somebody I know who's in the industry did, and I had a very interesting conversation with her. So activity in the Utica is up, but it's actually the lower layers where things are really starting to happen.
And Michael, do you think the oil and gas companies are, because they can drill more, will just start drilling more? I'm not sure that. I think they've gotten a different level of fiscal discipline.
I agree with you. I agree with you on that. We're seeing more discipline. We have not seen an increase in the rig count. However, the rigs are so much more efficient today than they were 5 or 10 years ago. They're drilling 1.5 mile horizontal legs in less than a week now, which is just amazing compared to what they were doing before. So
That's an example of the productivity gains that we're seeing today that we haven't seen before. That's a great example you just gave of how we've improved fracking there.
Right. So the things that I look at is over by Malvern, Ohio, there's a yard where the fracking trucks are held. So when I drive by there, I always look and see how full or empty is the lot. That tells me what's going on with fracking. I also look at the hotels in the area where a lot of the industry workers, most of whom are not locals, stay. So you can see in the evenings, parking lots full of white pickups and white work trucks from these, Halliburton and other companies that do the actual servicing of the wells. So things are busy.
Adam, you're back.
Yes, Stephen, quick question. Given that the economy has been running quite well over the past, 13, 14 years, at some point, recession does take place. Looking at the economy today, what is the weakest link that you see in that would cause a recession? What is the tipping point? What is that link? Weak link.
I think the U.S. economy right now is
Very strong.
humming quite well. I think it would be external. I think it would be an external issue. The conflicts expanding, China, something with China, something like that. I don't think it's our economy right now is running at a very healthy clip, and I would say that I don't think the Fed needed to do 75 basis points a cut on this economy given the strength. I think they actually may be leading to a market over enthusiasm for the market right now. So I think one of the things to keep an eye on though is really the 10-year. I think the 10 years moved up about 60 basis points since the Fed announcement on the 50 basis point cut in September. I think at 475, the less financially strong companies start to feel the pain in the market. And at 5%, I think even some of the larger cap companies that are better financed start to feel the pain. So I think those are the things to keep an eye on. But I also think that's the bond market vigilantes have been very active now, and they haven't had to been for a long time. And I think that's a force that need to be reckoned with, because rates I don't think are going to go the way everyone thinks they're going to go. I don't think they can go that low.
Thank you.
If they get that low, I think we're going to be sorry that we had to deal with low rates again.
So Giovanni, I look at you and I think of the person who told us about this thing called COVID in Miami, and it's a serious thing. What do you see the black swan being?
Well, there can be so many different black swans, but I think what America is underestimating is the degree to which Trump, be careful of what you wish, because you might just get it. Like I said, I think that the American people are tired of the Constitution, right? They think that freedoms allows for a serial killing axe murderer to live next door to them. So I think Americans don't trust freedom and protections. They want more government oversight and protections, like, the Patriot Act. Now there's some pushback, but barely. Okay. So I think that Trump will do what he says he's going to do, which is be more of an autocratic leader. I think that the liberals are laying low, they're bruised, they're licking their wounds.
But
Trump is likely to act like as an autocrat, and then suddenly I think that the liberals will push back, and we might. I think we are headed. I think we could have maybe not civil war, but I do think that the right will feel slighted.
Mhm.
They will feel like they're patriots, and they might defend their leader like he is being persecuted for being Hitler when he's not. You're not just Hitler because you persecute the Jews. You are Hitler because you crush, or you give a permission structure to push back hard, violently, aggressively against criticism. That I think Americans think that the guardrails will hold, and they don't realize how even if the guardrails bend, they can bend so to a point where people will find it intolerable. I'm very concerned about Trump as a
But-
president.
What I find it interesting, Stephen, is just as control risks had the head of political risk being a Brit telling Americans like what's going to happen in America, and here's Giovanni.
Yeah.
But look, there's definitely some fear. So there's that. I guess that's the black swan answer. There's going to be such a conflict in society. Okay, all right. I'm more of an optimist, but there are a lot of reasons to be not optimistic.
I
Michael?
actually think that, Giovanni, you're partially right that Trump had an appeal as a kind of a autocrat, but I think the real issue for the majority of voters was much more basic. It was concerned about the border. It was concerned about safety and security and walking safely in the streets of big cities. I think they feel like the government went too far the other way and not protecting the people. And they've lost, if you look at the election numbers, the big swing in the vote was, I don't believe it was the young male voters swung, I think 28% swing in their numbers from Democrat to Republican. And I think they felt disenfranchised with the system, and that was one big element of the swing in votes. I think Trump has a unique ability with his power of persuasion to identify pain points and speak to them in a way that captivates the audience. But I think the underlying factors are more basic than that. It was cost of living and immigration is what people voted against, I believe. And an element of in getting increasing conversation is identity politics, whether that backfired on the Democrats or not. I think it's more basic, though. I think it's safety and security, and I think it's cost of living. And ignoring that was a mistake in the campaign from the Democrats.
Okay, I'll make this very simple then. We were getting about 3 million illegal immigrants a year. I think it's down to about 1 million now, a little bit less than 1 million. And when I say illegal immigrants, you're only illegal if you don't report to Customs and Immigration. So if you land at JFK Airport with a tourist visa, right, cross immigration, but then pick up your luggage and go back to immigration and say, I'm an asylum seeker, you are a legal immigrant, right? If you don't come through a port of entry, so if you manage to make it in America, right, and you self-identify to Customs and Immigration, you are a legal immigrant. Just because you don't go through a port of entry doesn't mean you're an illegal immigrant, okay? The problem we have right now is that there is an abuse of the asylum process, right? It's not supposed to be an immigration process. It's supposed to be an asylum process, okay? We were supposed to have immigration reform. I'm in Oklahoma. I can assure you there are no liberals really of any substance and significance in Oklahoma. The fact that the senator from Oklahoma is what passed or championed the immigration reform legislation, and Trump sort of said, "Wash it. I need it to be an albatross around Biden and Kamala's neck." That's that. Okay. So quite simply, let's try to make it binary. If Trump deports about 1 million people a year, which would be huge, okay, they'll know where those illegal immigrants are, because they've all got work visas now, or a lot of them, the majority of them have got work visas. They don't stay on government assistance for more than, let's say, 3-4 months, unless they're in big cities, which is where they tend to be on the thing, because there's not that much jobs there. But so if you round up the the harvesters in fields in Georgia and Louisiana and so on and so forth, of which there was a dearth of them. So the prison system, I think it was in Georgia, Louisiana, allowed for chain gangs to work on the farms, and they found that those prisoners could not harvest the crop the way the immigrants could. Even with prison labor and a lot of it, they still could not achieve and there were a couple of farmers that went bankrupt because they couldn't pay for their farm loans and so on and so forth. Okay. Anyhow, so if we get, let's say, more than 750,000 repatriations or deportations a year, we're going to see an increase in inflation. It will be blamed on the fact that there is not enough cheap labor in America, and this will come to bite Trump in the ass. If there's less than that, let's say there's 500,000 deportations and less, maybe there's a minimal impact on inflation. But the reason why America's inflation after pandemic decreased sharper than the rest of the world is primarily because of its access to very cheap labor, which is, so-called illegal immigrants.
Giovanni, this is the chart of who's been deported back in time. Getting to 7.5 would be heroic for our government to pull that off, given their efficiencies. But these are the numbers, as you can see, what we've seen deported over time. So I think this range is something that the U.S. could deal with. I think the bigger issue for Trump, as I said, is I think the best outcome for him is securing the border to stop the inflows and work on getting criminals out. I think will be a win for him. Because I do think as much of the vote on this is about safety in cities. And I think and around the country. I think that's what's going to be the driver for that. But I agree with you. If he got to 7.5 million, our economy we'll have real problems.
All right. Michael Hammer?
Yeah, so I was thinking what Robin put in the chat about climate change being the black swan or a potential black swan. And, we look at now there's wildfires on the East Coast as well as on the West Coast.
I just drove through some of them yesterday.
We look at, and we're having brush fires here in Ohio because people are violating, there's actually a burn ban in place and people are like, I can do it anyways. But also when we look at the costs of like Hurricane Helene and other events, if those continue to increase, then how does that get dealt with? Where does the money come from? And what does it get taken from? Or do we deficit spend to achieve it? There are no good answers for that. And it looks like we're going to see more of these sorts of events at an increasing pace.
I agree. I think that's a great point from Robin. I think the climate that another round of natural disasters. We have a big rebuild in the South already here. You have these wildfires and floods and other things that are going on that are going to divert money. And I think this is where all the tax cuts start to run up into problems, because on one hand, we want to rein in spending, but a lot of the spending that we have actually needs to be done. So there is a rub there that you can't keep lowering taxes and, hope you're getting it on growth to offset that. So I do think there are market forces that you run into, and that's where the bond vigilantes come in. That's where people who are up for reelection come in. That's where if you can't get the services to rebuild areas, and the
And that's just-
Republicans in that state, you're not going to get it's going to be harder to get reelected. So I think the number one motivation for most politicians is the next term. I think most their behavior is driven by that. So I think that this is a problem that will create a need to divert capital away from other areas and makes it tougher to cut all the costs they're talking about cutting.
But also consider that Trump likes borrowing. His whole career has been built around borrowing. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, and that's where he's going to that's where the bond vigilantes matter. And he wants to push the Fed to lower rates, but if we keep lowering rates, we'll blow up the economy and you'll have kind of a tech bubble too, like we had in 99. I think you have to be careful about moving into that mode. And I'm not sure that as confident as everyone is that all the politicians in DC are going to follow along with Trump. I'm not sure that's the right bet.